Mergers and acquisitions, they're kind of a common event that occurs in our industry because it's a mechanism for growth for a lot of companies. Most companies grow through that process of either acquiring similar companies or they acquire companies maybe to gain some additional expertise or past performance or technical capabilities to allow them to go after new contract vehicles. But in a nutshell, I mean, a merger is just what it sounds like. It's two entities merging together, and so there's some common ownership that's retained from both companies. And an acquisition is just an outright acquisition where a company's buying another company. They may retain some of the key technical leaders or management for a period of time, but in general, they're acquiring that company. It's going to be folded into the larger company on an ongoing basis. So. One of the biggest risks that I typically think about early on in the process is the novation process that's required. So when the government awards a contract to a government contractor, they're awarding it to that contractor. And there are abilities to assign the contract to a third party. So if someone's buying you, you can assign that. But you have to go through an novation process and provide a lot of information to the contracting officer in order for the government to make a determination of if it's in their interest to novate that contract to the new owner. And in that situation, there's always some risk going into that. Novation typically occurs, but as you're acquiring, you certainly don't want to reach out to the contracting officer or customer in advance of closing the deal, but at the same time, there's a little finesse around the timing there. And so novation is one of the risks. The other risk is that a lot of times you enter into a letter of intent, there's a lot of due diligence, and you find out that maybe this isn't the right thing to do, and the buyer backs away. But those costs around an acquisition typically fall into organizational costs, and so they're unallowable, and so they can be costly. There's a lot of advisors and what have you that are involved, and it can get expensive if you have a dry run, a deal that doesn't complete. When I think about a merger and acquisition, I usually think about it in terms of the cost associated with it. A lot of the work that we do here at Redstone is around helping sellers sort of prepare for that acquiring event or that exit event, or in the process of working with buyers to go in and vet and validate a potential target and identify risks, things like open year incurred cost submissions and what's the true value of that contract backlog, looking at contract waterfalls, all sorts of things to help the buyer make a decision. But really in the acquisition process, there's three phases that I like to think about it, and I kind of call them allowable, unallowable, and maybe. So that first phase that I like to think about, what I call the allowable phase, that's sort of your pre-acquisition process. So you're going to spend, if you're looking to buy another company, you're going to spend a lot of time up front sort of identifying acquisition targets that are out there. And you may enter into some discussions, and really all of that falls into economic planning, is what's called within FAR 31, and those costs are allowable. But at some point you enter into phase 2, which is where you hit unallowable costs. So FAR 31-205-27, there will be a link down below, basically says that in the course of an acquisition, those costs that are associated with the acquisition are unallowable. And that's a very layman's explanation. There's a lot more in there. I'd suggest you go read it. But in a nutshell, usually the line in the sand is either at the point where the board makes a resolution or okays, approves, we're going to go after this specific acquisition target. Or the other line in the sand can sometimes be the submission of the letter of intent to kind of enter into that due diligence process. But once you cross that bridge, you're in unallowable cost territory. And those, like I said before, all the costs associated with an acquisition can be kind of pricey. So you're looking at paying for lawyers and investment bankers and CPAs, people like us that help with due diligence. So it adds up quickly, and those are unallowable costs. And then you've also got your internal costs too. So you've got your president, your CFO, your CEO, all those execs that are involved with that process. On both sides of the deal, their time is unallowable as well. And the last phase is what I call the maybe phase. So post-acquisition restructuring, if you have DFARS or DoD contracts, there's a DFARS clause. DFARS 231, 20570. That covers restructuring. There's some specific requirements around sort of pre-approval for restructuring activities. It covers things like severance and some other costs. And so when you're in that post phase and you're sort of doing the restructuring, the company's been bought and you're realigning things and doing the cultural alignment, all those fun things, it's maybe allowable. Generally it is allowable, but it's something you got to do some extra due diligence around. So. That's an excellent question. Every buyer that we've worked with, they have some general things that are common. Obviously they're looking for a company that's has ongoing profitability, ongoing contracts. There's some sort of value to that company post-acquisition, but increasingly in this space, we're seeing acquisitions that are sort of centered around a strategic contract vehicle. So a company may have an OASIS contract, or they might have a VETS 2 contract, or whatever it may be. And the buyer really wants access to that contract vehicle, and so that's a lot of the motivation for acquiring them. Obviously, past performance, technical capabilities, things that can add to the buyer's portfolio in terms of going after future awards, those are things that are certainly valuable. And then, you sort of look at other more kind of intangible things. There may be synergies between a business and another business, and they think that if we're doing this plus this, it's greater than, so those kind of things can come into play. But the things that kind of trend across, all acquisitions that we see is really the centering in on that contract backlog, doing a waterfall calculation, looking at everything that's on contract today and that's been awarded, things that are out for award and the probability of win on those, and then future opportunities that they're going to pursue, and sort of taking those future cash flows out and then using discounted cash flows, bringing them back to the present, and that's how you kind of get to the valuation around it. It's obviously a lot more complex than that, but that's the general idea. Future values or present value of future cash flows. So that's kind of a general overview. And if you guys have suggestions for topics you'd like for us to discuss, please let us know. And likewise, questions on the topic at hand. We're not trying to make this super detailed and technical as we go through, but we're happy to answer questions.